Hey friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you're interested in true crime, or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. So for today's chat, I'm honestly a little bit irritated. True crime has always been an interest of mine, and especially here lately, I have been diving in deep into this world to help with my YouTube channel, to help things get going. I watch documentaries, I watch docuseries, many different YouTubes. I listen to true crime podcasts, mystery podcasts. It is no secret that this is a huge interest of mine and that I'm genuinely fascinated by this world. So obviously I tell my husband about my interests. He is the first person I run cases by to see if they're interesting enough to talk about and to listen to. He is there for me during the entire editing process. He watches the finished video with me before it's ever uploaded. He has started listening to murder and mystery podcasts to try to help me facilitate some ideas. Like literally, when it comes to my YouTube channel, he is my number one fan, hands down. So why is it I had to hear about a kidnapping and murder case that took place during his lifetime in the super small town that he was born and raised through random true crime research? Like, you would think that he would tell me about that. Like, I mean, if this is my big interest and if I'm diving headfirst into it for my YouTube channel, you think that it would have been mentioned. It happened in 1999. He was like 10 or 11 years old when it happened. So it's not like he was watching the news every night. But when I confronted him about it and I brought this case up to him, he said, "Oh, yeah, that was a pretty big deal in Shepherdsville." So you tell your true crime wife that a big deal happened in your small town. So I think kind of like maybe out of spite for him not telling me about this, that's what we're going to chat about today. Because when I heard about this case and I kind of fell into this case, it actually is a pretty interesting case. I mean, it's not a cut and dry kidnap, murder, this is the guy, you got him, wham bam, thank you ma'am. It's pretty interesting. And like I said, the case starts in 1999, but it doesn't complete until like 2013. So it was a cold case for a long time. There's a lot of twists and turns. It's certainly interesting, and my husband should have talked to me about it. He should have mentioned it to me, but he didn't. No harm, no foul. So anyway, since my husband didn't chat with me about it, I have chosen to chat with you guys about it because now it's on my brain, now it's in my mind, and now I've done some research on it. So let's chat about it. And we are going to go to the year 1999 in the super small city of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, where my husband originates from. And we're going to talk about Jessica Dishon. So Jessica was a 17-year-old girl, and she was from a family of 5. Her parents were Michael and Edna, and she had 2 younger brothers. She was the oldest child. On September 10th of 1999, Jessica sleeps in a little bit while the rest of the family gets up and gets ready. Parents had to go to work, the boys had to catch a bus, but Jessica drove her own car, so she could sleep in a little bit. She didn't have to get up and get going as early as everybody else. So everybody had left the house by the time she was like up and rolling out. She gets up, she gets ready, and as far as everyone's concerned, she heads out of the house in anticipation of going to school that day. Her mom gets home from her shift at work around 1 or 1:30, and when she gets home, Jessica's car is in the driveway. This is a little bit bizarre, and so she goes inside and starts calling for Jessica to see if she was skipping school, if she came home early, like what's the deal? Why is her car here? And there's no response from Jessica. So she goes back outside. She calls her husband, Michael, and says basically, "Hey, did you give Jessica a ride to school? Did she catch a ride with one of her friends?" And her husband's like, "No. As far as I know, she drove herself to school." Well, Edna says she didn't drive herself to school because I'm looking at her car right now, and her car's here. Did she have car problems? Like maybe her car wouldn't start. And so Michael said, you have a key, see if the car starts. Like, see, maybe that was the problem. Maybe her car wouldn't start and it was after everybody had left. And so she had to call somebody else for a ride. So Edna gets in the car and it starts just fine. So when Michael arrived and Edna and him are looking through the car, they found Jessica's backpack, they found her purse, they found one shoe, and they found her cell phone. And this is 1999. Like, the cell phone she had wasn't an iPhone, it wasn't like an Android or anything. It was just, think of like the old school Nokia phones where it's basically just like a brick with a keypad on it and an LCD screen where numbers show up. Like, that's the technology they had in 1999. So they find her cell phone, and on that LCD screen, 911 had been dialed. So to them, and I'm sure to you, it looked like Jessica had attempted to dial 911 and something had stopped her. So they're sick. They are just in fear for their daughter's well-being. I mean, this is not something you want to see as a parent. So they end up going to the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department, like the Bullitt County Police, and they want to file a missing persons report. This is not right. A 17-year-old girl, she's gone without her phone, without her purse and her backpack. She's not at school. They had already called and confirmed that she is not at school. She's gone. When they get to file a missing persons report, they are told by the police there, she's a teenager. Teenagers run away, teenagers sneak out, teenagers, they're teenagers. Give it a day, see if she turns up, and if she doesn't turn up, come back and see us. But other than that, they basically brushed them off, which every time I look up a case where there are basically parents begging police, look for my kid, and the police just kind of blow them off, it just infuriates me so much because, I don't know, like, maybe it's because I'm a parent, maybe not, but I feel like I know my kids pretty well. Granted, they're still very young. My oldest turns 4 this week, and my youngest is 2.5. So they're still very, very young. But Jessica's 17. I feel like her parents would know her pretty well and would know if she had run off. You know what I mean? But police tell them, forget about it. Don't worry about it. Just go home and see if she turns up. So they left and they organized their own search for Jessica because the police were not helping. So they organized their own search. They recruited family members to help look for her. They recruited locals in the community. Like I said, this is a very small town. But when you're in a small town, it seems like everybody knows everybody and everybody cares about everybody, especially if it's a good kid. You have a good kid in the community go missing, the community's going to give a shit. The community's going to care. So they had family members looking for Jessica. They had the community looking for Jessica. And they started looking for her basically immediately, like right out the gate. Now, when they started to look for her, one of the places that the family had looked was a place called the River Bottoms. The reason why they started there is because Michael, Jessica's dad, his brother Stanley had said, nothing good happens in the River Bottoms. That's kind of the place that has the reputation for bad things happening. Like, if you're going to do illegal drugs, you go to the River Bottoms. If you're going to have a wild, crazy party and you don't want the police to be called on you, you go to the River Bottoms. So Stanley told Michael, God forbid, if she had been killed, the body's likely going to be dumped in the River Bottoms. I mean, that's just how it is. And so that's where they started their search, was the River Bottoms. And the family and the community was looking for Jessica, and they looked and they looked, and they had no sign of her. And they looked to the point where finally, it's emotionally draining on the family to be looking for this 17-year-old girl, thinking that there's a good chance she might turn up dead. I mean, that's why they're in the River Bottoms. Nothing good happens in the River Bottoms. So it's emotionally draining on the family and on her friends. So much so that Stanley, her uncle, ends up getting sick while he's there and pretty much telling the family, listen, we've got to stop. It's getting late. We've got to go home. We've got to regroup. Tomorrow we will revisit it. We'll go talk to the police again, but this is tough on everyone. We just need to kind of take a break. And so they did for the night. They called it in for the night. So the next day, the family contacts the police again and says, hey, it's been overnight. Jessica's still not home. We still haven't heard from her. We want to file a missing persons report. We want to have a police officer come out here and kind of take a look. So the officer they sent out was Officer Greenwell, and he was pretty new to the job. He was absolutely what you would consider to be a rookie on the team. And so when he started kind of examining the scene, he wasn't as well practiced in like gathering evidence and examining a crime scene as like a senior detective. So while he was there, he did note that there did look like there was a struggle in the car. There was a piece of plastic that was broken off of the car seat. It looked like her shoe, the shoe that was in the car, may have been knocked out in the struggle. Obviously, she left her stuff. The cell phone might have been knocked out of her hand. He definitely thought that there had been a struggle. And so he took really detailed notes, the best that he could, and he took pictures of the scene. So while he was there, since he thought that it looked like a struggle, he actually called the lead detective at that time, Charles Mann, and said, I think you need to come here and I think you need to take a look at this. And Detective Mann actually said, no, I'm pretty sure that this is just a runaway case, just another teenage runaway. I'm not coming down. Officer Greenwell would request the help from Detective Mann twice, and Charles Mann did not come either time. So again, you have this rookie cop there by himself, working this scene by himself, something he has never done before. Unfortunately, with that being said, since he was new to the job and a rookie to the job, he actually ended up contaminating the scene. He didn't wear plastic gloves, as he was going through the car. So any fingerprints were null and void, basically. He just didn't have the proper on-hand training to be cataloging and processing evidence on the fly by himself. What should have happened is they should have sent people there. The car should have been impounded, and the car should have been gone over correctly, with a fine-tooth comb and with gloves and properly. But the fact is, it wasn't. It was handled by a cop doing the best that he could with no help from the department. Still, like I said, he took really good notes. He took really good pictures, the best that he could, and then he took those and he passed those off to Detective Jim Adams, and they were lost. The notes and the pictures that he took, he passed them off to another detective, and they were just never seen again. So all the information that he collected on site that first day, gone. Crime scene, contaminated. Lead detective, not willing to help out. So it's already not starting out strong. Like, this is already starting out not good for Jessica, right? The family's obviously frustrated. So because there was such poor handling and poor evidence gathering and no concern by the local police and the local sheriff, the family actually reached out to the FBI and requested help from the FBI, which that is something you can do as a civilian. You can call and request the FBI to come help you. It's not guaranteed that they'll come help you, but sometimes they will. Sometimes they will. And in this case, they did. The FBI, absolutely, they came to Shepherdsville, which honestly, not that far of a drive, because Louisville, Louisville, however you want to pronounce it. I've lived in Louisville for a long time. I pronounce it Louisville. Louisville actually has an FBI headquarters in the city. So that's kind of cool. That was one of the first things that I went to kind of drive around and scope out when I first moved to Louisville, Kentucky. because it's just kind of cool. Like, I don't know, I like true crime stuff, and to me, it's cool being so close to an FBI headquarters. But I don't know, that's me nerding out. Anyway, back to the story. The FBI did end up responding, and the FBI came out and they started doing a search and aiding in the search. So by the time the FBI got there, now the local police is basically like, oh shit, maybe we should do something because the FBI is here now, right? Like, I guess it kind of looks bad on you if the FBI is coming in to work a case that you're ignoring. So now the local police are going to help in the search for Jessica. So now you have the FBI, the family, the community, the local police, the local sheriff's department, everybody in this super small town is looking for this 17-year-old girl. And still, no sign of her. And there wouldn't be any sign of her for 17 days. And after 17 days, her body would be found. So it actually ended up being just as Stanley, the uncle, suspected. She was found in the river bottoms, just like he had called right from the get-go. Nothing good happens in the river bottoms. That's where they started looking, and ultimately that's where the search ended. A school bus driver was driving through the area, and she had seen a body propped up against the tree, and she got out of the car and didn't even need to get close to the body to know it was bad. And she backed up. She called the police. The police came out, and it was pretty bad. I mean, it was already showing decomposition. It was not a freshly murdered girl. They ended up taking the body, and they asked her parents if they wanted to identify the body, which I can't imagine a harder task. They have DNA, they have dental records, they don't need a visual confirmation. The only thing that does is it's quicker. It speeds up the process of identifying Jessica and kind of getting closer to it. I don't know if I could do that. As a mom, I don't know if I could go and do that. I feel like that would be the hardest thing to do. Jessica's dad would not and could not do that. He flat out refused. But Jessica's mother said that she would take a look. And when she took a look, she recognized not only a necklace and a ring that Jessica had always worn, but a butterfly tattoo that Jessica had. And so she was able to positively identify that, yes, that is Jessica, which they would later confirm with, DNA and dental samples. And so now we have the body to work with. Unfortunately, she wasn't found alive, but we still don't know what happened. We don't know who, we don't know why. She did have an autopsy done. In the autopsy, it was found that she had been tortured a little bit. She had had some fingers cut off. She had been beaten pretty badly, and ultimately her cause of death was strangulation. One thing that just royally pissed the parents off, and I'd be pissed too, is that her autopsy report came back that she likely did not die until 2 or 3 days after her abduction. And for those 2 or 3 days, that's when she was being beaten. That's when her fingers were being cut off. She was living hell, literally hell, for those 2 or 3 days. And those are the 2 or 3 days that the local police department was saying, she's a runaway. She'll be back. Don't worry about it. So while the police are ignoring the parents, begging them to look for their girl, their little girl, she's being beaten and tortured, and then she would eventually be killed. I would be so pissed, it's not even funny. So the evidence that they actually were able to gather based off of this scene, rather than previous scenes that were contaminated, was they did find a piece of rope that was near her body. And they assumed, their best guess was that this rope was used to help move the body from point A to point B, which would be the tree that she was leaning up against. And also on site, her clothes were kind of partially off. It was like her bottoms were pulled down, which led the police to think that she had probably been sexually assaulted, but that wasn't forensically confirmed. It was just kind of a guess based off of how she looked and how she was dressed. So, also part of this process, once they had the body, was keeping, and it was kind of vague about this, I'm not going to lie, but part of the process was keeping part of Jessica's body. I don't know, but they kept part of her body for any future forensic gathering. I don't know if that means like maybe part of her DNA in case DNA technology improves in the next couple years or what. Like I said, they were very vague, and I read a lot of articles about it. Couldn't quite figure out what this was, but I do know that they kept something in the chance that they needed to have forensic evidence in the future. And they dropped the ball again because it was stored in a box that says keep frozen on all sides of the box, and they left it in a warm storage area for 2 years. So everything that was in that box, that DNA, that part of her body, whatever it was that they kept for forensic evidence, it was no good. It was null and void as well, just like the car. It's just really doing a good job here. We're really top-notch policing here. So now that they had a body, the investigation would switch from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation, which would lead FBI and local police to recanvass the area, kind of with like a different lens on now. We're going to talk to people, but now we're going to be talking to people knowing that whoever did this also murdered her. It's beyond just a kidnapping case now. Now we need to figure out who would not only take her, but take her and kill her. One of the people that they would end up questioning was the family's neighbor, Bucky Brooks. David Brooks, but he went by Bucky. And he was the family's neighbor. They went to speak with him, and when they spoke with him, he changed his story enough times to be raising red flags. First, he'd say, oh, I saw Jessica going down the street. And then he'd say, well, I saw her by her truck. And then he'd say, well, I was at work on that day. And then he was like, well, no, I was actually at home. Very inconsistent with the stories that he was telling. Suspicious enough that they actually took him in for questioning, took him in to give him polygraph tests. He failed the polygraph tests, and they got a warrant to search his property, where they took dogs to his property for a search. Now, the dogs ended up marking in 2 different locations. One was inside his barn. They had signaled, hey, right here. And there was a couch, and underneath the couch cushion was a pair of work gloves, and they had signaled right here. So they assumed that these gloves, maybe they were used moving a body, maybe whatever. They put the gloves in evidence. Another place that the dogs marked was outside. There had been another pair of work gloves along with some clothes that had been burned. And they marked here saying, hey, check out this. And so again, they assumed, well, maybe these were the clothes that was being worn and the gloves that were being worn during the kidnapping, murdering, all that. Maybe he's trying to get rid of evidence. So because of this, 16 months after Jessica's disappearance, on January 18th of 2001, Bucky would be officially charged with the murder of Jessica Dishon. And his trial would begin 2 years later in January of 2003. So by this point, Jessica's family is having their first real sigh of relief based off of what they have seen, based off of the way Bucky had been acting and the dogs, marking in that home. They knew he was guilty. The family had no doubts. They were pretty confident. They thought that they had caught the right guy. They were pretty confident of it. So before going to trial, this is the evidence that they had on Bucky. One, he had been changing his story a lot. He just seemed to be hiding something because he was this and then he was that and then she was here and then she was there. Like he couldn't keep his story straight, which I admit is pretty suspicious. But that is the first thing. That's the thing that led to all the other things. The second thing, they had where the dogs had marked in two different locations on his property, at the gloves and at the burned clothes and the burned gloves. So they had that. While they were on his property, they found rope on his property that was very similar in like the fiber and structure as the rope that was found near Jessica's body. So they argued that it could be from like the same, it was close enough rope that maybe we can make a connection that it was Bucky's rope. So not really a whole lot of evidence, and it's literally all circumstantial. And then he failed the polygraph tests. Like that was another big one. He failed the polygraph tests. So they end up taking him to court. And before court even begins, they get a bombshell dropped on them. Judge Waller, before the trial had even started, had declared that any evidence that they got from the dogs was inadmissible in court. We can't talk about it. We can't present it. It's not to be used. And the reason why, from the best of my understanding, is these dogs basically they're cadaver dogs. And so they look for bodies. Like that's their primary job. They lead you to a spot and say, look here. They're not saying that this is the evidence, or they're not saying this is the murder weapon. They're just saying, look here. Usually, yeah, when they say look here, it's because there is a body here or something. But they're not saying these gloves right here. You know what? Does that make sense? And so since there was no proof that these gloves were anything, or that these clothes and burned gloves were anything, they couldn't use it. Like they couldn't use that as an evidence. The judge had already ruled out that's inadmissible. So now they really don't have much, and now they have even less, but they go to court anyway. So Charles Mann, the lead detective, ends up being on the stand, and Bucky's defense lawyer, Vince Yustas, is drilling it into him hard, questioning Charles Mann hard about this case. Charles, if you remember, was the one who didn't even initially take it seriously in the beginning. He's the one who said this is a case of a runaway teen. And so Vince is just drilling into him, what kind of evidence do you have? Like, you have a rope that may be. And then he's being kind of weird with his story, but that's not really anything. What do you have? You have nothing. And while he's on the stand, Charles Mann, Detective Mann, ends up saying, well, we do have that, but he failed the polygraph. And immediately, as soon as he says he failed the polygraph, that's when Vince looks to the judge and says, mistrial. And the judge has no choice to declare it a mistrial, because polygraph tests are also inadmissible in court. You cannot talk about them. And the reason why it makes sense, polygraphs are notoriously bad at being accurate. They can test, but they test things like your heart rate, your perspiration, stuff like that. Polygraph tests can be tricked, and you can pass a polygraph while lying, but also they can kind of give false positives too, because since they measure things like your heart rate, talking to the cops is nerve-wracking, whether you're guilty or innocent. It can be a very nerve-wracking experience. And so, yeah, your heart rate could increase, or you could be perspired just because somebody's basically accusing you of murder. They're notoriously untrustworthy. And with that being said, it has to be declared a mistrial, because if you're speaking in front of a jury and you say someone failed a polygraph test, you cannot just look at the jury and say, pretend you didn't hear that, because they did. Like, you can tell them all day long, you can't use that information to make your decision, But they're going to. They can't not unhear it. You know what I mean? It's like if I tell you don't think about a pink elephant, that's the only thing that goes in your head is the pink elephant. This jury is going to think dude failed a polygraph test. He's obviously not being honest. So they were forced to have a mistrial. And the case actually ended up getting dismissed. And it would go completely cold for a decade and a half. 15 years, case runs cold. Now, after 15 years, Detective Lynn Hunt would revisit this case. And she would revisit it because she was actually revisiting several cold cases. And this just happened to be one that was on her desk. It came closer to the top of her pile when she had heard information from an inmate saying he knew who killed Jessica Dishon. Like, he had said that the murderer had admitted it to him. The murderer was in jail with him, in prison with him, and had talked about how he killed her. This inmate, one, was told, we're not cutting you any deal for information. So get that out right out the gate. So it's not like he was talking for some sort of gain. You know what I mean? He wasn't talking for some sort of gain. He was just telling what he had heard. There was no motivation behind it for him, I guess I could say. He knew information that was kind of kept quiet or just not disclosed. So the story that was given to Lynn by this inmate was that Stanley, Michael's brother and Jessica's uncle, was the one who killed Jessica. And the reasoning for this was that Jessica had been sexually assaulted and molested by Stanley for years, like 3 years. And then when Jessica was 17, around the time that she went missing, she actually ended up finding herself a boyfriend and started dating this boyfriend. And apparently she had confronted Stanley and said, this has got to stop. If you do not stop doing this to me, I'm going to tell on you. I'm basically going to tell people what you have been doing to me for years. Leave me alone. Let me be happy. I have a boyfriend. And this pissed Stanley off. So after the family left on September 10th, that day, Jessica got up, got ready to go to school, went down to her car, was getting in her car when she was confronted by Stanley. Now, obviously, it's a little muddy here because we don't have a firsthand account of what happened, but it seems as though Stanley had abducted her, taken her to an abandoned barn down in like the river bottoms area, and for 3 days tortured her, abused her, assaulted her, and finally ended up strangling her to death. And then he had moved the body, and after a few days he had moved it again where it was finally resting up against the tree, and it was in an area that would be discovered. Like you could see the tree. Before she was kind of hidden, but now you could see it, and she got discovered, and that was that. Lynn had this information and she had no proof. She did have a gut feeling, though, and I'll tell you why. One, Stanley was in prison talking to this inmate. And the reason why he was in prison was because he had been charged and found guilty of sexual abuse and sodomy of like an 8 and a 10-year-old little girl. So Stanley already has a bad record for molesting and victimizing children. And as far as I'm concerned, 17, it had been going on for like 3 years. So it started when she was like 13, I think. That's a child. So this is right up Stanley's aisle. Like this is right. It doesn't seem unusual, right? He's in jail for this exact thing. So it doesn't seem unusual. Another reason why she felt like this was a pretty good, solid lead was because a separate independent inmate corroborated the first inmate's story and said, yeah, Stanley told me this and he's told me the same thing. And I agree. Yeah, Stanley had told me this. So that was, okay, we're getting somewhere. The third thing is when Lynn had started to do this investigation and she was going over the evidence, she actually reached out to Bucky's attorney and said, hey, there's really not a lot to work with here. Like I said, they had contaminated all the evidence from the car crime scene. And then the evidence that was supposed to be frozen wasn't frozen. So I don't really have a lot to work with. Do you guys have anything? And so Bucky's attorney actually turned over what they had. One of the things they had was they had given Bucky a mental competency test to kind of see where he stood. If he did do it, maybe there was a reason up here why he did it. And that came back of him having an IQ of about 65, which is very, very low. Low enough that, yes, he was given a total of 6 polygraph tests. He failed 4 of them. 2 of them were inconclusive. But his IQ is so low, it is more likely that he just didn't understand the polygraph test than it was that he was actually lying. His IQ also explains why he's changing his story all the time. He just can't remember. He's just not very sharp. And I mean that with a loving heart and a kind heart. He just wasn't very smart. And so that explained a lot of the things that we had previously thought made him so guilty. It kind of explained that away. So Lynn, she's on board. Bucky's not your guy. I've got my eyes on Stanley, but now how can I prove it? I have no evidence other than a couple inmates. So Lynn would actually end up going with Michael Jr., one of the 2 sons who they called Bubby. And the 2 of them would go down to this area, the river bottoms, and they would start looking for this barn that was referenced by both the inmates where they had kept Jessica. And they did end up finding the barn. Now, by this time, they're not super hopeful because 15 years has passed. I mean, and this is the kind of place where partiers and transients and druggies and people pass through here all the time. So they're not super hopeful. They still go and they still take a look around. And lo and behold, when they're taking a look, they find on the ground what looks like a fitted sheet, like a blanket sheet. And when Lynn picks it, looks like the bedding that was on Jessica's bed set. And there was blood on it. So they gather it, and they actually ended up finding a pillowcase too. They gather it, they take it back to the home and compare it. Sure enough, it matches the bed set because they hadn't changed Jessica's room at all since she had disappeared. They kind of kept it as a memorial to her. They kept it just the way she had it, which was great because there's the bed set there. It matches perfectly. And when they pulled the comforter back, the bed sheet is missing. So that in itself kind of seems a little suspicious. And then, like I said, there's blood on the sheet set. Now, also during this investigation, there were 5 other family members that came forward and said Stanley had assaulted them or molested them during that time frame window. And at the time, most of them were 10 years old or younger. And so that kind of is stacking on top. And these people had agreed, if we need to, we can testify against him. So he's already in jail for it. You've got these people admitting to it. It just seems more and more likely that, yeah, Stanley's our guy. So because of all of this, because of the family members coming forward, because of the sheet that ties Jessica to this barn that was mentioned by these 2 inmates and the stories that these 2 inmates told, Stanley's lawyers said, listen, it's likely if this goes to trial, you're going to be found guilty. And Stanley knew that. Stanley knew if this went to trial, given all this stuff stacking on top and given his history, it's likely going to be a guilty plea. So Stanley ended up kind of cutting a deal where instead of pleading guilty to murder, they dropped it down to manslaughter, and Stanley entered an Alfred plea, which what that is basically acknowledging, hey, odds are y'all are going to find me guilty. I'm not really fighting that. The evidence that you presented is enough evidence for you guys to find me guilty. With that being said, I will plead guilty, but I am standing by the fact that I am innocent. So by entering this plea, Stanley says, I am innocent of all these charges, but I'm pleading guilty in order to have it reduced from murder to manslaughter so that way it won't be as bad for me in the long run. Because I'm going to be found guilty either way, but since we're skipping trial and I'm pleading guilty right now, I get the benefit of taking manslaughter instead of going to trial and being found guilty of murder. Does that make sense? I hope so. So now he is currently in the Kentucky State Penitentiary and he is being held there for the manslaughter, but also charges of rape, sodomy, sexual abuse, incest, and this is all from multiple victims. Like I said, multiple people. And it ended up being a total of 10 separate charges that he is being held for right now. Since his first charge was amended from murder to manslaughter, he will be eligible for parole December 31st, 2028, but he could serve until his release date, which would be August 31st, 2033. He's currently 63, which means regardless if he gets out early or if he serves his full term, he's going to be like in his 70s by the time he gets out. So here are my final thoughts. First, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, how frustrating is it to have a case that winds up being a murder case? Granted, hindsight's 2020. They don't know right out the gate that it's going to wind up to be a murder case. But how frustrating is it to have a case and have to deal with incompetent police officers? I've said it before. I respect the police officers. I respect detectives. I respect that genre of job. I understand it is a dangerous job. It is not a job that I would like to do. I don't think that I would be capable of it. So I'm not trying to detract from that. But when there are incompetent police officers or a police officer is literally begging a detective, hey, come take a look at this, it doesn't look right, and they're ignoring it, and then you wind up having a murder, it's so frustrating. It's just so frustrating to have situations like that, and it breaks my heart. This is not the first one that we've had, especially involving a teenage abduction that winds up in a murder, and I'm certain it's not going to be the last one we have. And it's just so frustrating when police don't police very well. It's just, and I'm sure there's lots of good officers out there. We're not hearing cases about, like, good officers do their job well enough that cases don't really get brought up because the job is done well. There's not really a lot to talk about. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? Of course, we're talking about bad police officers and bad police work because that's what makes this case noteworthy. You know what I mean? Like, a big part of the reason why this case is so noteworthy is the failures of it. And so not all police are bad and not all police work is bad, but this is a prime example of a department that really dropped the ball. I'm not saying they're bad police officers, but on this particular case, they majorly dropped the ball. Also, adding to that, I cannot imagine how the parents feel knowing that they're looking for their little girl, and had they not dropped the ball and had they come into it full force, Jessica was alive for a few days after being abducted. Had they come into it full force, they would have had a better chance of finding her alive. And that's just the truth of it. Another thing that I think about is poor Bucky. I mean, he gets taken in, he gets questioned. He's got a low IQ, so he's not even really comprehending the full extent of what's going on. He fails the polygraph test. He goes on trial for murder, and they're seeking the death penalty. And he didn't do anything. It ends up getting a mistrial. But after that, like I said before, the family was very confident that Bucky was the one who did it. People felt like, we have our man. So I know what it's like to live in a small town. My heart breaks for him because despite the fact the case was dismissed, you know that there are people out there who thinks he's a murderer. You know, when he went back to his home, his reputation suffered. You know what I mean? And for 15 years until 2013, this poor guy had to deal with being thought of as a murderer, which makes me so sad for him. And he has since passed away. And I'm just glad that his name was cleared before he passed. I mean, that just makes me really sad. It makes me super sad for him. Anyway, I always think it's super cool when a cold case gets solved after a certain amount of years. I mean, 15 years with virtually no evidence. To me, that makes this case super cool. Like, solved 15 years later, having basically nothing to work with. And from going from nothing to work with to solving the case, getting an arrest and having somebody behind bars for it. That is awesome to me. And that makes this case so interesting to me. And that is a big part of the reason why I was so mad that my husband didn't mention it to me. Because it just, to me, it didn't seem like a standard case. Like I said, there were a lot of components. There was a lot of weirdness involved around it. And it went unsolved for 15 years. Like 15 years, there were no leads, no headway, nothing on the case. And then it was solved 15 years later. And that's cool as shit. I don't care what you say. That's cool as shit. All right, friends, as always, it has been super interesting sitting here and chatting with you and getting all of this out of my head and into your head. And I hope you enjoyed the chat. I hope you enjoyed the tale. Let me know what you think. Make sure to put your comments down below if you're into that. If you are into this kind of content, true crime, horror, just kind of macabre genre, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And then when you're done with that, turn on the post notification bell. That way you can be notified the next time I sit down right here to go into another morbid chat. So until then, stay safe, take care. I'll see you later. Bye.